Welcome to Sew with Mrs. Herbert. I'd like to begin by thanking January and Randy Schaefer, owners of Cherry Berry Quilt Shop in Calamasa, California, for hosting this first episode. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Alex Schaefer for showing my husband and I the camera, microphone, and computer software we will need to make this series. In the 1980s, I taught hundreds of 7th, 8th, and 9th graders basic and intermediate sewing skills, such as how to sew a casing that would hold a drawstring or elastic, how to sew a facing on a neckline or armhole, how to sew a zipper. I'll teach you these and many other basic skills in Sew with Mrs. Herbert. In our first episode, we'll learn the basic tools you'll need for sewing and fabric terms. This is the notions wall at Cherry Berry Quilt Shop. This is a notion wall at a craft and hobby store. Please don't be intimidated by all the products you see. Just focus on the 5 tools that we're talking about next. We need scissors, pins, a seam ripper, a seam gauge, and a tape measure. First, with scissors, we're looking for a sharp cutting blade, and we're looking for as much of the blade as possible touching the table. For example, here I've got the ruler, so you can see a great length of it is touching the table. The reason for that is when you're cutting, you actually want the bottom blade to be on the table, and you want to make long, smooth strokes. When the bottom blade is on the table, you're not lifting it and distorting your cutting. So that's the reason why. So this is a nice pair of scissors. It has the features we need. In this case, it's a little too heavy for me, but if it fits you, if it's comfortable for you, this is an excellent one because it meets all those qualifications. Now this one is my favorite. It also has those qualifications. You've got a nice amount that's going to be on the table. It has a sharp blade. And now let me refer to that. You want the blades between them cut to be sharp, but you don't want it to be sharp. If you were to reach in your sewing basket, you wouldn't want the edges here to cut you. So watch for that when you're selecting a scissor. Okay, this one also is a nice choice for a sewing scissor. It's lightweight. You can see how it touches the table. It's inexpensive, so this is a very nice sewing scissor. This one, the blade is too short. You just make little choppy stitches, and again you'd see there's just about a 1/2 inch of the blade that's on the table. So this one is nice for trimming threads, but not for cutting out our fabric. And last of all, just to show you, this one is not a good choice because you can see that very little, just the point, would be on the table when you're cutting. So now you know what to look for. Let's take a look at pins. These pins are very pretty, but any pin with a plastic decorative head will melt if an iron touches it, so this isn't our best choice. Here I have a dressmaker pin and a satin pin. Your best choice for your beginning sewing projects is this dressmaker pin. If you look with my magnifying glass, you can see that the diameter of this dressmaker pin is just a little bit wider than the satin pin. That means that the dressmaker pin is less likely to bend. It's a little stronger. So that's your best choice. Let's look at seam rippers. This small one, you can see it's the one I've used for over the years, and most beginners will choose this. It's very inexpensive, lightweight. It has a plastic cap that you can use so you can hold it in your hand easier. And when you store it, cover the point so that you're not cutting anything. So this is the typical seam ripper that you'll use. Now this one, a little bit longer, more comfortable in my hand, and so as I've gotten older, because of arthritis, I like this one. But both seam rippers, no matter what seam ripper you get, they're going to wear over time. And it's very difficult to sharpen a seam ripper. So knowing that eventually you're going to need to replace them, this one is the more economical. Let's look at a seam gauge. This is a seam gauge. It's a 6-inch ruler with a plastic or metal slide. The purpose of this is to mark whatever measurement you're going to be using. I'll give you an example. I'm going to put the slide right at the 1 inch. And if I was going to turn this up to make a 1-inch hem, I would use my seam gauge to line up the top, and then there's the plastic guide. So I'll put a pin right there. Put my seam gauge down. Okay, now I'm able to pick this up and measure a little further away. And again, I want to scoot this down so that it's exactly 1 inch. So here we have the top at the end and the guide. So now I can measure and pin. And each time I measure, I don't have to look to see where that 1 inch mark is. So that's the benefit of a seam gauge. Now you could use, here's a 6-inch ruler, you could use a ruler. You might use something like masking tape, and here I'll mark it at the 1 inch. The drawback to that, I could go like this. The drawback would be that over time, taking that tape on and off is going to peel off the numbers and the markings. So your best bet, and it will last you years, is a seam gauge. Next is a tape measure. I have 3 here to show you. This is the tape measure I keep in my purse. I like it because it's sturdy, not going to get crushed in the bottom of my purse. It has, and this one has just inches, doesn't have centimeters, but it's retractable. But because it doesn't bend, it bends slightly, but it would be hard to measure your body measurements. So this is not your choice for a sewing tape measure. Okay, this is the tape measure that I have used for years. I just use a rubber band to keep it together, but you can see on one side it has inches, on the other side it has centimeters. It's 60 inches in length. You can measure the body very easily, so this is my go-to tape measure. Now, as years have gone by, retractable tape measures have become very popular, and this is a very nice, inexpensive tape measure that's retractable. You can pull it out. It has inches on one side, centimeters on the other. Push the button, and it retracts. Now, I will tell you that I recently broke one of these. I pulled it out too far. I wanted to see how long it was, and it was indeed 60 inches, but I pulled it a little too much at the end. I heard a pop. I think it was the spring, something broke inside, and so then I was no longer able to retract it. The button wouldn't work. So rather than waste it, I cut it off at the 60 inches and just threw away this part. So then I just have to wind it up like this. So those are the items that you will need for sewing. Now we're going to talk about the characteristics of fabric and the terms related to it. We start with fibers. Our fabric is made from either natural or synthetic fibers. Natural fibers would be cotton, wool from sheep, linen from flax. Synthetic fibers, examples are polyester. We find frequently mixed with cotton in fabric. Nylon, such as nylon stockings. Acrylic, very often used in the yarns for knitting and crocheting. So first I want you to understand natural versus man-made. And what we're going to use for our first project is 100% cotton. Now, let's take a look at this. This is a picture of how the yarns are woven together before we even make fabric. Okay, this is a spool of thread, and I pulled it apart a little bit. You can see, very, very tiny, that there are two yarns here, and they're twisted together. Well, if I had a microscope, perhaps, or a magnifying glass, you could see that there are even finer fibers that have been twisted together to make that yarn. So it's quite a process. So whether it's natural or synthetic, this is how the yarns are made to make up the fabric. So I say yarn and you think, oh, crocheting or knitting. But this is actually one example of a yarn. The thread is a yarn, just a type of yarn. Okay, with that information, let's look at how we're going to examine our fabric. There's woven fabric, knit, or non-woven. So here's an example of a plain weave. You can take those yarns one way and the other, and you can see how they're woven in and out. Now, there's different kinds of weaves, and because we're just beginners, we're not going to talk about all of those. But this is a plain weave, which is what we're going to use in our first project. Here's an example of a fabric. It's 100% cotton, so we know it's a natural fiber, and it's woven. It's this, okay? So a woven cotton. Now this one, I can feel from it, it's not 100% cotton. I know that it has a little polyester mixed in it. So it's a cotton polyester woven. Okay, we choose woven fabric for our beginning projects because they don't stretch much. As an example, I can pull it this way, there's a little give. I can pull it this way, there's even less give. Now interesting, the part that it has the least give, that is going to be the lengthwise grain. This is the crosswise grain. And now if I pull it on a diagonal, that's the bias. Okay, a little ahead of ourselves, but that's something we're going to need when we start pinning our pattern onto our fabric. So we understand that we're going to use a cotton fabric with a woven weave. Now let's look at our next one. You've heard a lot about knits. Here's a picture, obviously bigger than usual, of the way a knit is. It's all these yarns that are looped together, overlapping. So that makes it very stretchy. Let's take a look. Again, I have two samples. This one from Feel, I know that it's both a cotton and a polyester blend. Now I'm going to stretch it a little bit. There's a little give. There's a little give. And there's the bias. Now let's try the next one. Here's our 100% cotton. Wow. A little less. And then there's the bias. So one of the differences between why one stretches more than another is how close these little loops are made together. So there's all these variables. So I just wanted you to have an understanding that this is a knit fabric. And in my class, we're not working with knits at this time. We're working with wovens. Now the next one, just so you're aware, this is a picture of what we would consider a non-woven. It's not a knit, and it's not woven. This is interfacing. This is used within collars. For example, for the garments you're making, it might be in a facing. And facing is something you're not aware of yet, but when we get to it, you know that, oh, I've seen that stuff before. So this one is used within the layers of fabric. So we have non-woven, knit, and a plain weave woven fabric. We're looking at a piece of fabric that is 100% cotton woven. This is the right side of the fabric. It's folded in half, so let me show you that this is the wrong side of the fabric. Two basic terms. The right side, you think of the outside of your clothing. The wrong side, the inside of your clothing. with that in mind, let's talk about other terms that we'll need to know to pin our pattern piece onto the fabric. This edge is called the selvage. Now, because it's folded in half, this side is called the fold. That means we have these edges left. That's called the raw edge. This is also the raw edge or cut edge. When we roll a piece of fabric off the bolt, these are at the top and bottom of the bolt, and then you cut off the portion, the length of the fabric that you want. Now, when I was showing you fabric squares earlier, we talked about the grain. The lengthwise grain goes the length of the fabric on the bolt. It is parallel to the selvage. The crosswise grain then goes the opposite from the lengthwise. It's at a right angle. It goes from selvage to selvage. And then the bias, which is at the diagonal, and has the most stretch. All right, so with that in mind, I just wondered if you could take a little quiz. Let's look at this. Can you name these? We've got A, B, C, D, E, and fold. All right, selvage. We start by saying, okay, where's the fold? So if this is the fold, then the selvage must be where? D. The raw edge. Well, if this is the fold, this is the selvage, the raw edges or cut edges must be here. Lengthwise. Give you a minute. A goes the length of the fabric when we take it off the bolt. The crosswise grain goes from selvage to selvage, and the bias is the diagonal. Now that you know what tools you'll need and a number of fabric terms, I encourage you to do two things. One, look around the house to see what tools you may already have. And two, check out the clothing in your closet. Determine whether each garment is woven or knit. In episode 2, you'll learn how to take body measurements, how to use a brand name pattern book, and how to read the front and back of a pattern envelope.